WomanUp podcast speaks to and about women and non-binary artists, as well as academics, writers, activists, midwives, carers and more. Those challenging ideas and ideals, questioning assumptions and provoking social change. It's a podcast dedicated to creating a living archive of these people and this work that anyone can access. We find those trying to change current structures founded on bias. Those working intersectionally across gender, race, sexuality, disability, as well as having caring responsibilities. We have conversations about lived experiences, achievements and aspirations, as well as fantastic artwork. In 2023, for Series 5, we received a National Lottery Project grant from Arts Council England to take the podcast on tour. This episode was recorded as part of this tour at Manchester Art Gallery. The conversation is facilitated by myself, Susan Merrick, but co-hosted with Natasha Howes, Senior Curator of Manchester Art Gallery.
Hello and welcome to the WomanUp podcast on tour. We, myself Susan Merrick and producer Amy Dignam, are recording today at the gorgeous Manchester Art Gallery, who have kindly partnered with us for this episode. Joining us today is Senior Curator of the Manchester Art Gallery, Natasha Howes, alongside artist and curator Mary Griffiths and artist Susie MacMurray. Natasha, as you both know Mary and Susie well, I'm going to hand over to you for some proper introductions. But firstly, I'd also like to say a massive thanks for having us, especially as a northerner. Myself, it's extra special to be finally recording a podcast episode up in the north, so thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. So I'm really delighted to be speaking to two artists who I've known for over 20 years. So the first one, Susie MacMurray. Susie's an artist who works in drawing, sculpture and architectural installations. She delights in materials. She works in all sorts of things: feathers, rope, antlers, balloons, wax, barbed wire, velvet, the list goes on. And also the body is at the heart of her practice. Working in installation and sculpture, she's gained a reputation for poetic, site-specific interventions in historic spaces. Her work typically references the history of a space and merges the particularities of that history, the specifics of the site, and the meaning of materials to gain insight and raise questions about the relationship between place and people. Drawing is also an important part of Susie's practice. In addition to her large-scale pen and ink works, she extends the possibilities of making drawings using unconventional materials, including rubber tubing, hair and wax. She lives in Manchester and has an international exhibition profile, showing regularly in the US and Europe, as well as in the UK, and she is also in public and private collections internationally. So Mary Griffiths was born in the Wirral and lives in Manchester. Mary's practice begins with drawing and the close observation of urban, rural and industrial ecologies and architectures. These rapid figurative drawings are developed in the studio in graphite, ink, print and paint. They are also the root of her abstract works, through which their essential geometries are rendered. She's exhibited at the Royal Academy, Christia Roberts Gallery, the Turnpike Gallery in Lee, and the Museums of Science and Industry. And she also has a permanent wall drawing at the National Graphene Institute in Manchester. In April this year, she was awarded the Gattenby Fellowship at the School of Art, History of Art and Cultural Studies at the University of Leeds. And her work is in the Arts Council collection, the Turnpike, the Whitworth, Manchester Art Gallery and in private collections. So welcome both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Those are very impressive introductions, both of you. Very excited to have you on the episode.
So what I wanted to do is I wanted to start with how I met you both, because I think they're both quite interesting stories. So Susie, I'm going to start with you. So I first encountered your work, now I can't remember which year it was it 2000, 2001 I think?
I think it was 2001.
2001, yeah. In the top floor of Islington Mill. And Islington Mill is a former textile factory mill in sort of on the Manchester-Salford borders. And there was an exhibition there. And what often happens in Manchester is that artists, if they don't get shows in public institutions like this one, they take over a space and they create a show. And there was a lot of that going on when I arrived in Manchester. And I went to see the show, and on the very, very top floor, you had to walk up some stairs and you put your head through into the attic room and into the sort of big, huge, big loft space, and it was covered in white feathers all across the space, and you had this beautiful kind of light coming in, and it was just this huge installation. I've never seen anything like it. I had no idea who the artist was. There was no labels. I was going, who is this artist? Who is it? Nobody could tell me. And it wasn't until, I think, a few months later when you had your MA show.
It was a year
later at the Manchester School of Art, that I was looking through your portfolio and I saw that piece, and then it all came together. And then we worked together after that, didn't we?
We did.
And I commissioned you to make Flock,
Yes.
which was a site-specific piece in one of the historic gallery spaces here, where you sort of wallpapered the room in these black, iridescent, sort of greeny feathers. Flock was sort of, I suppose, referring to the idea of flock wallpaper. And we had, I remember the installation period, because that was, people would stop you and talk to you, what are you doing? And then when the piece was opened, we had visitors saying, could I just rub myself up and down the art, please? And your work does provoke lots of interesting reactions in people.
I remember Val coming in and saying, how are we going to stop the visitors just taking their clothes off and rolling around the walls?
Yes. So that's how we met. So we've known each other for a very long time. And what's been, I suppose, a delight for me, is to see how your career has really gone from strength to strength. And, we might not meet each other for a few months, 6 months or so. And when I see you, you've made another extraordinary piece of work. So that's how we met.
That was wonderful for me, because that was such an important meeting. I think that's the value of the way the Manchester system of people just putting stuff up and being able to go to Islington Mill and just use the space. Because I resolved something that I had been confused with on my degree show. I was on a sculpture degree, and I was trying to make objects, and I was always trying to do too much with things. And then suddenly, to have this space and go, could I use the attic? And they just said, sure. And it's like, wow, all I need to do is put the stuff in this place, and it has a conversation with the building, and I suddenly know more about how my work works and what's too much. So, but then that led to everything. It led to meeting you, and having a thing here led to all sorts of other things. It's why it's so important for emerging artists and students to get that happy, lucky coincidence.
Susie, I'm interested in a lot of the work that you make, which I've only seen one piece live, which is the piece from the Manchester Art Gallery collection, Widow.
Yeah.
But that has a similar effect on audiences, in that you really want to touch. You're kind of repelled as well, but a lot of the materials you use seem to have that idea of drawing people to touch them. Is that intentional?
I can't help it. It is intentional, I think, and it's because of it's stuff, it's materials. I almost want to be in it. And I suspect it comes from my music background. I looked at it a lot on my MA and tried to understand why would I go from being a classical musician playing in the Halle, in this big orchestral setting. I could have done anything. I could have been any kind of artist. I could have been an illustrator. I could have anything at all. Why am I this kind of artist? And I think it's the haptic connection, the connection between touch and vibration, something to do with being immersed. I spent all of that time in my first career being smothered by music. You're sitting there on the stage and it's all happening round you and through you, and you're vibrating within it. And maybe that's just my language, and maybe it's just what I know, but I want artwork to, dissolve the boundaries between me and it.
I think there's something also about the repetitive nature of being a musician, all that practicing things over and over again. And in some of your installations, they take a huge amount of time to make. You have a team of people helping making, and it's very repetitive work. You're making the same thing over and over again to make multiples of whatever the object is. And I wonder whether that's also a similarity with musical training.
I think absolutely. It's the building up small things to make a big thing. And I spent all my training playing scales and practicing things over and over, and also making reeds, because I was a bassoonist, and you have to make your own double reed, which is a very, if you've ever seen, they're beautiful things, sort of two pieces of bamboo that's been curved and put together, and then you make what's called a Turk's head with thread on it to bind them. So they're little sculptures in themselves. I had no idea I was making sculptures back then, but I think that's just a sort of, also it calms me. It's my OCD, I guess.
And Mary, coming to you. So I arrived in Manchester to take up the post of curator at Manchester Art Gallery. And I didn't know until, I think, probably a year afterwards when I met you, that you had done the role previously and you'd just vacated that, allowing me to come to Manchester. So thank you.
You're very welcome. You've done a good job.
And you went on to be the curator of modern art at the Whitworth.
Yeah.
And you did that for, until
20 years.
until
I did
very
that for 20
recently.
years, yes.
And then I think it was in 2009 you did an MA in fine art.
I did, yes.
And then you became an artist and you were working as a curator whilst also being an artist. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, doing those two things at the same time.
Yeah, that's certainly how it happened, but it was more of a slow process than a sort of sudden transformation. So I'd always made work when I was a child, and then as a young person I used to make videos and Super 8 and lots of photography. But I wasn't making actual things. And then I think getting to the Whitworth was a real catalyst for going back to actually making drawings, because, as you know, it's one of the great drawing collections of the country. And there was I with complete free rein over it. And also acquiring works and really getting to know. What I'd say is that collection was one of my teachers, because I could look at works, look at drawings day in, day out, in a way like that practice that you were describing, Susie. So my practice became looking at those drawings and putting them on display to try to get to understand them more. And I found that I really just fell back in love with drawing in a big way. So I began to draw, but had to. This was entirely me being self-conscious about it. Nobody else minded, I don't think. But there'd been quite a convention in the past that curators didn't make art. And when I worked here, I used to work here. When I worked here at the City Art Gallery, that convention reigned, and I was basically told to not be creative when I was curating, which that doesn't exist anymore. Curators are creative people. But I was certainly crushed down into my place at that point. But at the Whitworth, I was just allowed to be, and as I say, it began to be my teacher. I began to draw, but I was quite awkward about it at first, and would have to force myself to go off and draw in public rather than just keeping it private. To realising that if it was going to be a proper practice, it had to be a public practice as well. And then I began to it began to be a more fluid and fluent practice. And then the Whitworth made it possible for me to go and it was Maria Balshaw was the director at that point, and she was she was suggesting very kindly that I might want to do one of those management courses, the Claw Leadership. And I said, you see, Maria, that's not really my thing. I don't really want to do that. I said, well, what do you want to do? Because she was wanting to shape my career in some way, very kindly. So I said, what I'd like to do is an MA in fine art. She said, okay, you can do that. So instead of doing some management training, I was allowed to have a day off a week to go and do an MA in fine art at MMU with Pavel Buckler and Ian Rawlinson and a gang of 20, 30-year-olds. And it all began then. So that self-consciousness that I'd had about making work, I had it still when I was starting to do the MA. And one of my co-students just said to me, Mary, the only person that's wound up about this is you. I thought, yeah, you just put this away, this nonsense, this nonsense. And what I found as well was that artists in Manchester and the students on that course, and then other artists who I'd be working with, after a while we talk about this, but I wouldn't announce it straight away, but they just opened their arms wholeheartedly to me. It was, come over to this side, you're very welcome. So that's when it really began to flourish once I was doing the MA. And then I think really, to tell the truth, that's really, it's only then that the practice actually began to emerge. And it was interesting what you say, Susie, about the practice of scales, and obviously the practice of art, making art. And Pavel was a very formative influence to me and lots of other artists who come from that period of doing an MA at MMU. And he used to use a musician working the scales as an example. He was saying, look, musicians will work every day. They'll go through the scales, and what you need to do is draw every day and just keep doing it. And that's what I've always thought. A musician will be doing is, I need to do my version of the scales.
That's such an interesting story. Now, of course, sadly, I went the other way and I did the Claw Leadership Shorter course, and you did the MA in Fine Art, and and I suppose what I'm interested in, and I haven't done the maths, but I think you were both in your 40s when you did your MAs. And so you became professional artists later on in life, having had very successful careers previously, both of you. So I suppose I'm interested in, I don't know, were there any... it's obviously very different, isn't it, becoming an artist, a professional artist in your 40s to if you were 20, 21, 22. And I'm just wondering about, did you feel any kind of barriers to your involvement in the art world? Were there any advantages? I suppose there's a whole question about visibility, isn't there? Especially, I think, perhaps as an older woman, I'm speaking personally, it's that kind of, sometimes you feel slightly invisible the older that you get. And I just wondered what both of your experiences were.
Okay.
Yeah, Susie.
I think there's positives and negatives. Mostly positive for me, I think. I must say it was hard as far as confidence went, because my changing career came out of, I'd had my kids. My youngest had was about to start at reception. So it's like, what am I going to do now? I don't want to go back to freelance music and start again with the grind of all that. And also it had some sort of fairly dramatic family stuff going on, and had actually had some counselling and done some art therapy. And that was the impetus for doing art, was because I'd been asked if I painted or drew or anything. And I said, oh yes, I do watercolours. And she said, I don't mean the kind of paintings you'd want to put on your walls. And it's like me, who'd never had any experience of art, the art world at all, because I'd grown up in the music world, didn't know any art history, knew nothing. Didn't have an art A-level or anything, because I'd grown up in Canada. Thought, oh, what's that mean? And ended up doing a foundation course and just having it blow my mind completely. But I think I went and did a small foundation course at Mancat. And I think that MMU would have been too much for me. All those youngsters running around, all confident, and I needed a little bit of time just to kind of figure out that I deserved to be here. But then also, I think the positive is that if I'd gone to art school straight out of school, I wouldn't have had anything to make work about. I would have had no life experience and no time to reflect on who I was. And I used art to try and figure out what had happened in my life so far, and I still do. I use it as a way of existing and a way of coping. And I don't think I'd have had that. Somebody said to me once that they were in a coffee shop in Wilmslow with me, and she said, oh, that was my friend, she was just here. And then she came back later and she said, oh, she doesn't look like an artist. So there's two things. Should I have a beret, or should I have pink hair and piercings? What does an artist look like? Especially, I said, oh, I'm just an artist cunningly disguised as a middle-aged, middle-class woman, So, but it is really interesting, that, isn't it? What are we supposed to be? How do we perform ourselves in the art world?
I have had people say to me, Max, I went to do my MA at 35 when my youngest went to reception, and I'd had no art education because where I'm from in Hull, we just, apart from GCSE art, there was no introduction to it. I had no idea that in the 90s there was a great art scene going on in Hull because I was oblivious to it because we weren't introduced to it. And when I went to uni as a slightly older woman, you know, who had kids, it was that idea of, here's another one, you know, almost. It's like, have you not thought about why there are women at this age who are coming in? It's because they've finally maybe got a bit of resources, finally got some confidence to come in and do something, and learn that it's an opportunity, that it's something you can do as a career. Whereas when you are a younger woman, if you haven't had that influence, you know, who's going to take that direction at that age, maybe?
That's right. When so I came from a similar kind of background where these things didn't happen. Nobody went to university. It's that kind of story once again. And so I was good at school. So I went and did English literature, and I wouldn't change that. I really wouldn't change that. I had this vague idea that you could go to art school, but I had no idea how you went to art school. Nobody shaped that for me. It seemed more obvious how to go and do a straightforward degree. And again, I had a great time in museums and galleries, and it gave me an awful lot, vast amounts of it, which has fed into my life as an artist now. But the business about being an artist now in my middle age, so I'd say it's only now that I'm a full-time artist. So that business about, because I'm not young, you're not young, there's never the danger of being fashionable. We're never going to be like all curators, and I did this, and Natasha will do this. All curators will at one time be searching for the young new thing. And it won't be me and Susie, because we might be doing new work, but it's not going to be us, and we're just going to be sort of passed over for those things. Yeah. And I've felt it happen, and I thought, okay, I've applied for lots of residencies and things, thinking, I'm not getting that, am I? Because when I look at the photograph of the last year of the residency, there's a load of young, usually white people sitting around a table thinking, okay, I see what you're doing, it's none of us lot over here. But that's not a complaint, that's just an observation. And now that I am making work full time, and it's been going on for 20 odd years now, I also think that there's, because I think it's quite cerebral. I mean, it's abstract and it's cerebral. There's a great sort of intellectual drive behind it, but it's also deeply personal, and it's very inflected by my, as you described, by my personal histories and places. And I think that the people who like it, who do respond to it and do put it on show, are seeing those things, and those things are born of experience, exactly as you've both described. They wouldn't be there if I'd gone when I was 20. They're from other experiences. So it's just the way the cookies crumble, isn't it?
And it's interesting because I was also thinking about some other older women artists who only really got their break later on in life, like Rose Wiley, who got her break in her 70s, amazing painter, and then Phila de Barlow, who, very sadly died recently, who obviously she had an amazing career as a teacher, but she only really started exhibiting when she was in her 60s. And you think, goodness me, why is that? I mean, sorry, it's a rhetorical question, but it's just. I mean, do you think about the future, the next 10 years? What, are there things that you want to achieve, things you want to do? I suppose that question really is related to how much control do you have over your career? I mean, obviously you have complete control over the work that you make in your studio, but you don't really have control over who might commission you in the future.
No. None, really.
What places you might work or show. So, how does that feel, I suppose, to be in that quite, precarious situation? Is it precarious?
I think it is. I don't know. I think the way I approached it from the beginning, the only way I can do it without completely freaking myself out, not being able to make anything at all, is to treat it as an adventure. And I think that's how I started. It was like a chance to have a second life when I started You know, oh my God, I didn't know that this existed. I walked through the wrong door. I should have walked through that door instead of this door, and whoa. So I never had, I don't know if you did, I never had a sort of idea of how my career should go, and you know, I wasn't at all strategic. I was just lucky and worked really hard with the luck. And I think that's what's happened, a bit of common sense, and that's where the being older allows you to be a bit more sensible and be more sensible, that's a terrible thing to say. Be a bit more aware of when something comes to you, what you could do with it. But I've never gone, oh, well, if I did that, maybe, you know, this might, and I've never sort of, I can't, I'm really bad at networking and all that stuff. I'm terrible. Because it doesn't feel genuine to me, because that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the work.
That's right, because it sounds the same for me. So the only thing that matters is making the work and seeing what comes from that. And similarly, so I've got this strange situation where I know all of these people in the art world, and some of them I contact, and some of them contact me, and that's very nice. So there's a lot of possibilities there. But you mentioned earlier on, Natasha, that there's a sort of holding back, as I do. But you mentioned the Gatenby Fellowship that I've just got, which is brilliant to have, and it goes on for 2 years in Leeds University, the School of Art there. And one of the reasons for that, the person who was to have that was to be sort of in a sort of middling kind of stage with not some great flashy career. And the fellowship was to help them shift onto that greater national presence and also international presence. And that's exactly what I need to do, to have more shows nationally and also to push out into the international, which yours doing very well already. But that's the lack in my career so far.
I think that that touches on a problem. Is being an emerging artist is something, and you push and you've got a sort of a momentum, but that mid-career point, I think 20 years on now, I think it's really difficult because you're not the new thing anymore, and how do you go on, and are you trying to go up? Can you just go straight on? I don't know, because I have that problem now as well, wondering. I have a gallery behind me, but I'm not quite sure what strategically I should be doing. All I can do is make work.
Sustainability is something that comes up a lot on our episodes with other women and non-binary artists we talk to, of all ages as well. So we've spoken to quite a few artists who are now in their 70s, and a lot of them had big breaks because it was not sustainable, especially through the late 80s and 90s. And then they've come back more recently because for some of them they're quite sceptical about why they've been able to come back, because people are bringing their work out of collections because there's been more interest in feminism and looking at gender gaps in shows and collections. But they're sceptical that it won't last, and that they've got a little bit of a hello, and then feel like they're hiding back in the cupboard again. But it's that sustainability. How as artists do we continue with or without gallery representation if you're not the new fashionable thing, or what the mainstream expects.
I mean, I wonder if there's also something about sort of, I think you both sort of described this, but sort of knowing who you are, and I mean, I was thinking about both of you. You've both built your own studios. You both have really, really beautiful studios, and really beautiful, and they back, they're both, in your houses, they back onto your gardens, there's a sort of inside-outside thing going on, and they're really lovely spaces to be, and, probably you wouldn't have had the resources as a 25-year-old to have done that. And I suppose I wanted to ask you really both about those studio spaces and what that enables you, to do, or what that gives your practice, because it's very different from going and working in one of the in the suburbs of Manchester. So yeah, Mary.
So exactly. I used to have a studio in Artwork Atelier in Salford. And I knew at the time it was going to be knocked down and turned into flats, and guess what? It was knocked down and turned into flats. So that was always on the cards. And I thought, I'm kind of too old to be sort of wandering from one icy studio to another. And so I thought, okay, well, let's build one. You're exactly right. You know, there was you know, my wage that was coming in, and also saving whatever I was making out of art. I was able to do that, thinking, okay, it's going to build a studio. So that's what happened, and I had both of them going for a while. And of course, they have completely different tones and tempos. And I used the one in Salford really for showing myself work, to see what it looked like in a different kind of space. And then I thought, once that got knocked down, we were all turfed out. I thought, well, if I need a bigger studio to make something, I can borrow one off a friend or rent one for a short period of time. And at the one at home, in the garden, even though it's just in the garden, there is a complete shifting of perspective as soon as you go out the back door, out of the house, because I used to have a studio in the house. I'll just use the dining room, it's just a mess. But that shift from the house into the garden and then into the studio, and it has a different perspective. It just shifts me around and looks at the garden rather than other people's houses. Exactly. And my practice is mainly pieces of paper or pieces of panel that will fit on a table not much bigger than this. And it's always a glass table as well, because I'm pushing all of this graphite into this paper. So most of the work I do happens in a space, it's pretty much the same size as this room, and will happen on a table that size. So there are also massive wall drawings that happen. You described one earlier, Natasha. So of course, when they happen, it's not a solitary event at all. It's with a big team of co-artists who are contributing to that and making that together. So I think I have quite a solitary nature anyway. So I need the house, family, the books in the house, the garden, and that's where the ideas come from. And then I have a good circle of friends who are artists and curators. So there's all of that liveliness of that world as well. So I think that studio definitely shapes some of the work that I do.
Mm-hmm. I think mine does as well. I did a very similar thing, started out in cold freezing spaces and was a member of a lovely studio group for a long time called Sweet that was basically the MA students that I was with, and then was at Rogue Artist Studios for a while. And then decided I'd always wanted to build a studio space and just decided it was time and did it. But I think I still have another space. I still have a space at Artist Studios in Rogue, but the home space is so convenient and so nice and so not cold.
Yeah.
That I work there more and more, and I always say in my head, well, I'll go to the other studio if I want to do anything big and rough and loosen up, and I rarely go. And I do think that the studio at home does affect the work that I make. I have to work really hard to be more robust in my work. I can get very tight and very nice and prissy and things that I hate in my work. I have an ongoing dilemma, and the battle in me for my work is between getting too precious and too meticulous and being really big and bold, and it's the tension between those things, I think, that makes is what the work has its energy in. But I do sometimes wonder, I love my studio space at home, but I do sometimes wonder if I need to push harder against it, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
So I don't know.
To push yourself into that struggle with a new space.
Yeah, it's such a nice space. I make work that's too nice in it. You know what I mean? Needs a bit of grit, needs a bit of freezing and, sort of scruffiness in it, and to, a bit more Phila de Barlow, really. I keep, going back to that. Come on, play, don't be precious. And my space, I love it so much. And I think it's a bit less now because I've grown into it and I don't really mind so much of this stuff on the floor and, you know, making marks and everything. But at first it was a real shock. The space is so beautiful. I feel scared to do anything. So I don't know. I find it's an interesting dilemma between the two.
I think where people work
things.
makes a big difference to the work, doesn't it? And I have had I've got massive FOMO that I didn't have a young person career in art, because I feel like I have a very rose-tinted glass version of what it would look like to be a very bohemian artist. And but I went to Istanbul last year and I spent a week with some fantastic artists from Turkey, Germany, and another artist from London. And in my mind, all of them live far more a bohemian lifestyle than I ever have. And a lot of them much younger, and those in their 20s have got, you know, the big cold warehouse type spaces, or just any spaces they can get. Not because that's actually really where they want to be, it's just because that's what's available. But, you know, in my mind, that's where exciting stuff can come from, because you can collaborate. But both of you have found other ways of collaborating, as have Amy and I. And I think that it's almost like an alternative to those big studio spaces, isn't it? Actually, just is the collaboration space.
Yes. And that's where my messiness comes from. But you describe it very well. And I think I learned this practice of the type of collaboration I'm doing. I realise I learned it as a curator, because as a curator you work very closely with an artist, and it's all that back and forth and talking. And then when I began to work as an artist with scientists and musicians and poets as well, I'd come home and I'd think, oh gosh, of course it's like being at work again, but it's not for the production of somebody else's work. It's me that's part of this circle, and very much enjoying having, as you say, you know, all of those different ideas feeding in, and not being afraid of that, allowing all of those different voices and that conversation. So I've been for a few years been making work with some biophysicists, some of whom are in MIT and Massachusetts Medical School and Newcastle and Leeds, where I'm at Leeds University, fortunately. And when we started making that work together, they'd give me all of their imagery to do with cell development that they're working on. It's brand new research. And I'd do something, and I was quite happy to just fling it back to them. I was thinking, gosh, this is great. I'm not at all self-conscious about presenting it to them differently. I said, and we'd be working on Zoom, and they'd be making marks on the screen as to where other things might go and feeding into it. I was thinking, this is really, I could see how my practice had shifted just then, where it wasn't just me, there were other voices coming into it, and modulating it. So I have this very sort of public one, and I have this very, very private one as well.
I think it's about having control of it.
I think the work that comes out of the studio is incredibly controlled, and it doesn't have that. And then the work that I'm making collaboratively takes me to other places. When I did a work with Brighter Sound commissioned me to do something, me and Kostya Voslov, the scientist, and we made this drawing video using graphene, and then that was being projected at the Hatton in Newcastle. And for them it was all completely normal, Brighter Sound, you know, producing music in Manchester, and there was a small ensemble, and they were playing music that had been composed for to do with graphene. And I was standing there in this small sort of lecture theatre in Newcastle, absolutely mesmerised, because there was my drawing doing its thing with all of this music going on. It's completely ordinary, but for me, that moment where sound smashed into my work was exhilarating. Okay, I'll do this again.
Wow.
Yeah, there's not those kind of things that anybody can tell you to do and tell you it's going to happen. But that's what made me think, okay, allow more into your work.
And just to say, Kostya is the man who invented graphene.
He isolated graphene, yes, and got the Nobel Prize for it in 2010. That's right, yeah. He and I have made several works of art together. Yeah.
And do you talk the same language? Because I imagine talking to somebody, a Nobel Prize winning scientist, I would struggle to know how to communicate with them.
I have found, I've found that scientists of that kind of calibre, they're incredibly creative people and talk in metaphor and draw. So ideas would pass across the table and we'd both be scribbling them and drawing them, and this happens with the other scientists, the biophysicists I'm talking about as well, where that exchange is in our kind of language. It's so much imagery, and this is what I'll do at Leeds as well. I'm meeting lots of scientists, and the idea is, show me the images that you're working with.
I think there's such a crossover. It sounds really exhilarating, because at the level that scientists are working like that, and the way artists work, it's about curiosity. Don't you think? It's about, you've got past the sort of trying to work out all the sort of detail stuff, and it's about what if. And in the end, scientists and artists are asking exactly the same question. They're just using different tools to poke at it with.
Yeah,
and that's really exciting.
Yeah, Barbara Twelty-Evans is an artist I've worked with previously on collaborations, and she was working with neuroscientists down in Southampton. And we had similar conversations about, like, what is this going to be like? Were they going to just think we're weird? And actually they were so excited, because they had some other people coming in being excited about their work. And actually they are really excited about looking at cells on a cellular level. So to be able to show how they manipulate that and do that, and then have someone else who is not a scientist be really excited about that for different reasons, they absolutely loved it. And I think that kind of cross-disciplinary work is really important for everybody involved.
Yes.
I remember something that you once said to me, Susie. I sort of say, what have you been doing? And she goes, and you just say, I've just been playing. And I love that, because it's a completely modest and thing to say, but of course you've been experimenting and exploring and being curious about materials and how they might change and how you can manipulate them, and and I just love that idea of being playful.
Because I think play has gets a bad rap sometimes. It's so important. We knock it out of children. We sort of make it as though it's a sort of vacuous thing to do, a flippant thing to do. Play is really serious.
It's because it's open-ended, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's open-ended. You don't know where it's going to lead. Whereas, obviously, we just make our children go through school, and you will do these exams at the end, and
you've got to achieve it. It's about outcome. No.
And you don't have that openness.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So one of the things I wanted to come on to, sort of talking about collaborations, was that you've both worked, I suppose, with groups of women to produce work. And Susie, in your case, I remember, as I said before, some of the installations you make are just, on a scale that is enormous, and there is no way you would be able to produce and make them on your own. And I remember once coming into your studio when I think you were at Rogue, and I think you were making Medusa, which was a garment sculpture inspired by the story of Medusa. And there were a group of about 5 women, and you were all sitting around a table, and you were making chain mail out of copper wire. And it looked like the most... I'm somebody that's always in a rush. I never have enough time, sitting down, slowing down, making that... couldn't have been your assistant in that. But what I loved about seeing that was the conversations that you were all having. And I think more recently, particularly when you were working on the piece that was shown at Tatton.
Gathering.
Yes, that you were working with some older women then, and I just think that idea of sort of domestic industry, everybody sitting around creating something together, which is can be quite cathartic, therapeutic. I don't know how. Yeah, can you talk a bit more about that? I suppose what it gives you, apart from obviously the making of the work.
Yeah.
What does it bring? What does it add?
I think a bit like you were saying, it's the collaborative part of it. It's other people bringing themselves to it. I think it's a really ancient thing. If you think about fairy tales and weaving and spinning and people's sitting around a table and making quilts, and it sort of comes from that history. But human beings have always done that. But I love like you said, the mixture of people, because it's just such a generous thing for people to offer their time to come and do this mad thing. Like you say, it's insane. I was making, Medusa, and she was a feminist sort of reworking take on the Medusa story, and she's not a monster. But I needed chainmail that was just the right gauge, and I couldn't get it. I could not get it done by someone else, and if you want it how you want it, then you have to make it yourself. So I bought masses of thick copper wire and had to literally make the rings on a sort of jig and a machine, and then sat around with a mixture. And it is, I do really like that when you get a mixture of students and other people who've come along the way, sort of people sort of come out of the woodwork, and that's when it's really interesting, is when everybody gets together and you get people of different ages and different experiences, and the conversations they're great. Sometimes it's really, really naff, sort of really banal, sort of everyday stuff, but other times it gets really profound. And if you've got a mixture of women of different ages and different experiences, it's like a sort of, it must be what would happen when people were sitting around making quilts, and it's the wisdom of life being passed on, and somehow doing that, the work gets made and it goes into the work, I think. I don't know how to explain that, but I think it does. And with Gathering particularly, that was really poignant, because it was a piece of work that was made, it was commissioned for a fundraising organisation for the East Cheshire Hospice. So they wanted a piece of work that was about what the hospice does, and that idea of gathering people together and keeping them safe, and they wanted something also that could be have lots of elements that they could possibly use to promote supporting the hospice. And the strange thing that came out of that is that the people who helped were so varied. I had some students and then a lot of other people from the local community who I'd never met and would never connect with. And several of them have become some of my closest friends. And so in a way, I was making this piece of work, Gathering, that was all about loss and, being held and, really quite painful stuff. But actually, in the end, it gathered me up, and it gathered all these people together and sort of opened other doors. So it was a sort of magical experience, but being open to other people's lives and other people bringing things to the work. I love it. I love that part of it. I like my privateness, like you, Mary. I do like my quiet studio that I can go and just play and work, but I do also love that collaborative part. You need a balance, I think.
And Mary, I wanted to ask you about when you were creating the piece at Turnpike, Wild Honey, which was a big wall drawing inspired by the Astley Green Colliery. And I think you worked with, was it 4 women or 3 other women?
It might have been 5.
5.
Yeah,
Okay.
there was a little team that...
Yeah, well, there's a great photograph, a really cool photograph where you're all wearing like navy boiler suits and looking quite cool. And I wondered about that experience because a lot of your work on paper is quite small, but you did this huge big wall drawing, and I just wondered about how sort of having to let go of some of the. I mean, obviously the authorship, you are the author, and that you created the piece, but you're entrusting other people to help make it.
Yeah, because when I was doing my MA, I made a small wall drawing, little thing, and I remember Ian saying to me, because we were going to have a show in Lisbon, and he said, of course you can make a wall drawing, and you could get somebody else to do it. And I was horrified. What's somebody else to do it? What's not me? And of course he was saying that to me to make me think about it. Do you have to do all of this yourself, Mary? So there'd been a few, 1 or 2 wall drawings where maybe 2 of us had worked together, maybe 3. And then one of those is Naomi Lethbridge, another artist who used to be in Manchester, is now down in Cheltenham. And so she and Nicola Ellis, excellent sculptor, and Nina Chua, I say they're my team who we always work together, and then other people would come in and out of that. So we learned how to do this together. I'd described, how we'd apply it to the wall, and then, of course, their experience of pushing graphite into plaster would come into play because they're all artists in their own right. And also, Naomi is really good at maths, so I'd do a drawing, and I'd say, this is the drawing, there's the 20-metre long wall, and she'd help me with all of the scaling up, so her input into that was significant. And then with the wild honey drawing in particular, because some really excellent things came out of that, because we've made these drawings before, it's filthy because it's loads and loads of pots and pots of graphite. So we wear boiler suits because it's filthy, we wear respirators because it's filthy and carcinogenic, and it's very, very tiring. So we can all do about a square metre a day of this where we're applying graphite and then more layers and more layers. And then it finally gets to a point, once you can see your nitrile glove reflected in it, it's got enough graphite, and then you can start polishing it. So we burnish and then we polish. And after the first day of us all working on this one, and it was to do with the idea of, because as you say, it was to do with Astley Green Colliery and the Lancashire coalfield, which I'd had a residency at Astley Green for a year in the freezing cold winter. And there we were all dressed up in our boiler suits, working hard with all of this filth, making this drawing about coal. And it was only because we were all there in the room together and we looked the way we were that, of course, it just dawned on me that we looked exactly like the pip-brow lasses that used to work the Lancashire coalfield, and that they used to have, there's those photographs that would be made by Wigan photographers that would be sold on the street because they were thought of as a curiosity, as these strange women who were working in a man's job, which it hadn't been a man's job. It was a job that families would be working seams in the coalfield, and women would be down the mine with children, with these dreadful circumstances. And then, because there was such horror about women working down the mine, there was a legislation, the Mines Act, I'm not going to remember the exact date of that, where women weren't allowed to work down the mine at all anymore, and they could only work on the surface. And that's when those photographs of pip-brow lasses began to be produced. And they'd wear great costumes, sort of Lancastrian shawls, with tartan shawls and scarves around their heads, and they'd wear trousers, and this became it was mentioned in Parliament. Questions were asked in Parliament about these women wearing trousers. So there we were, filthy, in our boiler suits, working as artists, which of course artists are always slightly on the edge of things. Anybody in Lancashire is always slightly on the edge of things. And those women who'd done that job, who were considered slightly freakish by one part of society, within their own community, not at all. So that night I went back home and was looking at those photographs that strange Arthur Munby as well collected of the pip-brow lass, and thought, God, this is great, this is what we're doing. I'm not saying that we were working on the mine, but there was a symbolic connection between their work and our work in Lancashire. So the next day I said, well, what we're going to do is every day after our work, we're going to take a photograph, and there's just going to be one, and we're all going to assume these positions because these women would look so defiant. So I think there is a phrase, was it defiant in their dirt, that's been written about them. And I thought, okay, we'll be defiant in our dirt. We'll just look straight to camera. We'll all be covered in filth. And I'd give them instructions. I'd say, right, remember, you look basically slapped arse face. Yeah, you're really tired. You've had enough. You want to go home, but just stare at the camera and look really strong. So, and I'd position them, and we'd take one photograph, and that was it. And that only came about, that element of the collaboration, because as you can see, those artists just, okay, we'll do this. That only came about because we were there together. I didn't think beforehand, and what we'll do is we'll all pretend to be pip-brow lasses, and then we'll write something about it. It's only because they were there, they entered into it, and there we were, we sort of just fell into that role. So that's a very, that's a
great story.
It is a great story.
Yeah. So have I got time for one more question?
Yeah, I was gonna jump to it if you didn't.
Final
anyway.
question. I suppose I'm interested in, both of your thoughts really on being an artist based outside London. And also, I suppose, how that connects with gallery representation. Mary, I don't think you're represented by London Gallery, but you've shown in 2 commercial galleries in London, haven't you? And Susie, you're currently represented by Pangolin. You did have a gallery in New York, Denazy Corrie, and you had 2 solo shows with them. So I suppose I'm interested in, what it's like to have a career not being based in London, and and how you can interact with the commercial world, I suppose, from here.
Yeah, and I would add, what are the benefits as well as challenges, if there are any, to being an artist practicing in the north, or this part of the north?
I think something we touched on earlier is the generosity of being up here. I wouldn't say it's. I don't know enough about being an artist in London, but it feels more competitive and more. Competitive. Whereas here, my experience has always been that everybody's very generous and everybody's very helpful and very just up for it. It's like Islington Mill, which is the most fantastic place. It's just, if you want to do it, people will help you, and if you have the energy, they'll go with you. And I'm not sure whether it's quite the same in other places. Maybe that's a particularly Manchester or Northern thing. I don't know. And just, I guess, expense-wise. Having, talking to students and talking to the girls at the gallery in London, and finding out about, the people who are working there, and finding about their experience, and just not being able to have a studio space at all because you can't afford it. And I think maybe later on, not so much, but certainly when you're starting out, to have that space to like you were saying, making different sizes of work. You make work according to your space. If you give someone a table, they'll make table-sized work. And if you give someone a warehouse, they'll think warehouse, and they'll make warehouse-sized work. So maybe there's just a bit more breathing space up here. I don't know. That would be my, first observation.
What about you, Mary?
Well, I'm from the northwest. I've lived in Manchester for 40 years, and it's really important to me that I'm here. So that's not going to change. I think it is important for me to have a presence in London, and that's when I am part of shows there. That's really important for me, and I need to have more of that. And part of that's up to me So artists who friends who are artists in London describe to me that sort of circle of going to private views and being present, and having those relationships with gallerists in London, which I have as a curator, but not necessarily as an artist. Now that's never going to happen because there's one train an hour, the 3 trains an hour, and it's so expensive. But I think for me personally, making sure that I have some kind of presence there is important if the work is going to pay its way. So I used to be quite the idea of selling the work and those things that people are sort of gauche about at first, but that's a really important thing for me now, that it doesn't change the work I make, but it should be sold, it should be seen, it should be sold, and London is one of the centres of the international art world, so that's a good thing for me to move closer to all the time. And then that's a way as well for me to be seen, to be picked up internationally, and that is important for me.
I think there's a cachet in saying that you're from Manchester, though, you're based in Manchester. So, because, if, like, when you're talking to other curators, or, because, I don't know, there's so many artists are based in London, aren't they? And you just think, well, it's a bit different. Hey, Manchester, ooh, what's, bit of intrigue.
Yes, yeah. And everything that Susie was saying about, sort of the generosity within Manchester and Liverpool as well is exactly right. And I'd say, so there's my personal ambitions or wishes, and that would go for so many artists in the region. And another good reason why you're doing your tour around the country, so because you're from Hull, you know that those artists are around the country. They're not just centred on a tiny little, well, very big city, but that bit of the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
That's a cool place to end there, isn't it? Before everyone melts in the heat as well. Thank you all so much. Natasha, thank you for having us here. Mary and Susie, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. It's really, really important to Amy and I that we raise more and more profiles of women artists across the country and internationally. So yeah, massively important. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was very well done. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the WomanUp podcast. To find more of our episodes, subscribe via any of the usual podcasting platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, and more. For captioned episodes, please visit the WomanUp YouTube channel. And for news and updates, follow us on Instagram at woman.up.podcast.